Welcome to Series 3 of the Kyero.com Spanish Property Podcast, where we interview people who recently bought their dream home in Spain. They tell us what worked, what didn't, and what they do differently next time. I'm Beth Davison, and this week we have a special guest on the show. I'm speaking with Peter, a solicitor at Judicare, a firm which specialises in providing legal advice for all aspects of overseas property. He'll be telling us about some of the infamous stories where buyers just didn't seek the advice of a solicitor. Just wait until you hear about how a cliffside property with phenomenal views may not have been the most perfect purchase on paper. Check out the show notes at kyero.com/podcast to find links and resources mentioned in this episode.
My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor at a firm called Judicare, and I specialise in international legal issues, mainly relating to overseas property in a whole range of different jurisdictions. But my personal specialism is Spanish law.
And I was going to say, does Spanish law differ widely from kind of global law or European law? Is Spain a kind of law unto itself?
Well, Spanish law is very, very different from UK law. They work in completely different ways. They're much more codified over there and so forth. But there's actually quite a lot of similarities between Spanish law and some of the other European laws, because they all some of them are based on Napoleonic codes. So, for example, Spanish law is very similar to French, Portuguese and Italian. Although they're very different from each other, you can see the very basis of how they work, and some of the principles are very, very similar. So as far as the law is concerned, it's probably easier to think of Spain as a mini version of the EU. So you get the national governments introducing certain laws, but then you get the autonomous regions within Spain being allowed to introduce those laws in certain ways. So some laws are enacted throughout the whole country. Other ones are given a bit more free rein in terms of the autonomous regions. So, for example, you get things like the rate of inheritance tax is slightly different in a lot of the different autonomous regions, because that's one of the things that the autonomous regions are allowed a bit more freedom on. You get things like the ability to rent out properties in the islands, for example, is more protected than on the mainland. So you do get variations from region to region. And
in Spain, then, you mentioned cancellations and things like that. Are there any issues that for you are at the forefront of your mind as soon as you speak to someone who says, I'm buying in Spain? Are there things that come straight to mind as, okay, watch out for this?
Well, the main question that we get asked at the moment is all about legality of properties. We saw a number of years ago when all the scare stories came out with regards to new developments and people losing their money in illegal planning permission and things like this. And that seems to have sort of hung around in people's minds. So when people are buying now, we often get asked about that sort of issue. And that's clearly at the forefront of people of their minds when they're actually buying something that they're naturally nervous about.
Yeah, and how accurate were those horror stories? Because you always hear the worst ones in the news, but were they true? Was there truth in it?
I think you're absolutely right. I think there was quite a lot of bad reporting on those, even back in the day. Obviously, bad news makes the news, whereas good news doesn't. So, someone buys a property and it all goes okay and they get good title and all the rest of it doesn't make the papers. Whereas somebody where it goes wrong does. And of course, that's the sort of thing that sticks in people's minds. There was quite a lot of bad reporting on this. Clearly, there was some issues, but a lot of the issues weren't quite as reported. And a lot of them weren't as bad as was made out.
Fair enough. And there are individual case studies, which we've discussed, that really kind of jumped out at me. I've got the man who paid a 10% deposit in cash, but didn't know what country he was buying in. Tell me about this, because this seems impossible to me.
Well, this was actually an ex-partner of mine who dealt with that particular one. And he had a client who came to him and said, I'm buying a property in Portugal. Could you have a look at the contract? I've already signed it. I've already paid a deposit. I've paid the deposit in cash as a 10% deposit. Can you have a look at the contract? Because I'm signing the title deed tomorrow. And he had a look at it and said, well, actually, the property you're buying isn't in Portugal, it's actually in Spain. And this guy was rich enough to take money out of the bank to pay a 10% deposit in cash, but didn't actually know what country he was buying in. Now, admittedly, it was relatively on the border, but it does show how people can get themselves into all sorts of trouble simply because they assume certain things.
And do you think that assumption comes from wanting to cut corners, wanting to save a bit of money and not getting the independent solicitors involved soon enough?
One of the things that we tend to find is that people underestimate the costs of buying abroad. So one of the major things that they should be looking at is how much is it going to cost them to buy in terms of legal fees, land registry fees, notary fees, taxes, the whole lot, and then work out their budget for buying and work their way backwards to how much they can afford to spend on the property, rather than looking at their budget and thinking they can spend that on the property and then worry about everything else later. Because what I tend to find is that they underestimate how much it costs, and then they start cutting corners. And they start cutting corners on legal fees, valuations, surveys, all these sort of things.
So, of course, legal advice is imperative. That's what we're learning. Yep. Can you get the right and wrong type of advice? Are there certain lawyers who will like you do, who specialise in, Spanish law, but also European law? I mean, how does it work?
I think there's several things. I mean, first of all, you obviously need someone who understands what they're doing. You can't, generally speaking, just go down to your local high street lawyer in the UK and ask them to help you buy a property in Spain or Italy or wherever it is, because they won't have the first idea as to what they're doing, generally speaking. And if they try and do it, they will probably get themselves into all sorts of trouble because the systems are very different. So you definitely need someone who actually understands what they're doing. You need, whether that's a specialist like ourselves or somebody local on the ground. The next thing, which is probably just as important, is that lawyer is independent, i.e. they're acting for you and not for the seller, the developer, the agent, or whoever it is, just like you would do in the UK. So when you're buying a property in the UK, you don't always get your own independent lawyer to advise you on it, and it's exactly the same abroad. Again, we see this time and time again where people have used a lawyer. They think they're using someone independent, but they're actually recommended by the agent or the developer or whatever it is, and they're acting really for them. I know one particular lawyer who does all his work comes from one particular developer.
Wow.
So, of course, he's not going to annoy that developer because suddenly he'll get all his work cut off.
Now, you mentioned kind of land registry and surveys and that kind of thing, everything that you would associate with buying in the UK. Is rights of access across land is one thing that you've mentioned that I'd not thought about in the UK, certainly. Is this something that crops up a lot when buying abroad? I know there was a specific case involving a celebrity. Love a celebrity story. Yes,
absolutely. At a basic level, what you're doing when you're buying property abroad is exactly the same as when you're buying a property over here. You need searches on the properties. You need to make sure the seller actually owns it. You need contracts. You need to make sure that the property is all okay. You need to go through to registering the property and signing the title deeds and all the rest of it. So those basic steps, it's exactly the same as buying a property over here. And part of that is things like surveys and valuations and all these sort of ancillary things. As part of searches on the property, we do occasionally find rights of way over land, just like you do in the UK. I mean, for example, my mother has a right of way through her garden. There's a pathway that walks her right of way so that the public can actually walk through the middle of her garden.
Right.
And she knew that when she bought it. And you can get the same thing when you buy a property abroad. So one I did recently where we actually identified that there was a right of way over the plot of land that the property stood on. The seller didn't even know it existed, but it was actually registered. And unfortunately, because of the way it was registered, it wasn't actually clear where this right of way went, although we think it went through the garden and effectively through a wall in the garden, which meant that it was a fairly old right-of-way and it was unlikely to be used. But in theory, because it was a public right-of-way, in theory, people could come along and say, actually, we've got a right to walk along here, so take that wall down and I'm going to walk through your garden. So, these things do crop up every so often. And as you mentioned, I had another case where we were acting for a drummer in a fairly famous band. And we identified that there was a right-of-way through his garden.
Yeah.
This was a purchase in Spain. And, for somebody like that, is even more important because, the chap that I was telling you about before, we just put an insurance policy into place so that if the rights of way started getting used, he'd get some sort of compensation for it. But someone famous buying a property with a right of way, the last thing that they want is suddenly the paparazzi doing a search on it, finding that they can actually walk within a couple of meters of his back window.
No, totally. That would be slightly disastrous. Never something
Absolutely.
you really think about, perhaps, unless you're a famous drummer.
Well,
or a famous musician.
It's something you need to think about anyway, because it's all privacy, and you think you're buying a private plot of land with your own garden and things, and then you might find that someone has a right to walk through it. But so all these sort of things need to be sort of researched when you're buying. Absolutely.
And something else that cropped up on a survey was something that you wouldn't have realised was the house that you mentioned with a beautiful view across a valley.
Yep.
Unhindered, but perhaps not for a great reason.
Well, absolutely. So we had a particular client who was buying a property in Italy many years ago, and they were waxing lyrical over their property because it was beautiful and it had beautiful views over the valley, uninterrupted. No one could build in front of them because of the way the valley was and so forth. And we recommended they take out a survey. And they were a bit doubtful as to whether they should take out a survey because most people don't take out surveys when they buy properties abroad. But, we said, it's recommended you get a survey. So he listened to us and went and took out a survey. And the survey effectively came back and said, yes, the reason why you've got uninterrupted views over the valley is because the house that used to be in front of you is now at the bottom of the valley. And your house is next.
Oh, no.
So funnily enough, he didn't buy that one.
Yes. No, that sounds very sensible.
So it does show, a very quick survey, it may cost you a bit of money to do that, but actually saved him an absolute fortune in buying something that could have been disastrous.
Well, of course. And you would never think to do that in the UK. So it's interesting that people cut corners abroad.
The number one problem is people not using lawyers in the first place. And it may surprise you that as a lawyer, one of the most common questions we get asked is, do I need a lawyer when I'm buying property abroad? And my stock answer to them is always the same. It's, well, would you buy a property in the UK without using a lawyer? And they say no. And then I say, well, why on earth would you think of buying a property in a country where you've never bought a property before, where you don't know the legal system, you probably can't speak the language without using a lawyer? And I think part of the reason for that is that they don't know where to go. They are told it's all very easy. And in Europe, they tend to use the notarial system. So a lot of people will tell them that they don't need a lawyer, they only need a notary. Whereas in fact, that's not true, because the notary gets involved right at the end. He doesn't advise on contracts and all the rest of it, generally speaking. So it's a very different system, but that does allow unscrupulous sellers and agents to try and persuade people that they don't need a lawyer and they only need a notary.
Well, you get into holiday mode, I suppose, a little bit.
It's exactly that, absolutely. And they forget that actually what you're doing is exactly the same as when you're buying a property back in the UK. And they do relax. It's nice and warm. They may have had a bit of drink while they're looking at the properties. They're not thinking totally straight. Absolutely. And as you say, they just relax and don't do it. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, they get told that no one else does it, so what's the problem? So it's very easy to get swept up by, well, no one does this, so therefore I don't need to. Whereas, in fact, the same reasons apply no matter which country you're in.
Of course. And is it the same legality with what sellers can do? I know that you've had a couple of instances of sellers altering the property in some way after prices have been agreed, but before completion.
Yes. I mean, this is part of the reason why you need an independent lawyer to go through your contract, because your contract should set out what's included, what's not included, etc., etc. And if you are buying contents and things like this, that needs to be set out in an inventory and so forth. But we always also recommend that people inspect the property before completion to make sure that the property is as it should be. So, a couple of examples that I can come out with that one. I had an example a few years ago where a client was buying a property in Spain, and we recommended that they inspect the property before completion. And they turned up to find that the seller had actually ripped out all the solar panels and the generators and all the rest of it.
Wow.
Despite the fact that they were supposed to be included. And if he hadn't turned up, he would have completed, paid all the money, and moved into the house to find that was all missing. And that was all specified in the contract. That was all supposed to be,
And so that is then either he didn't have a solicitor or it's negligence on the part of the solicitor for not reading that contract correctly?
No, that was we were doing the contract on that. So we actually set out in the contract that all these sort of things should be included.
Fine, okay, and that was
it was only because we did that and because he inspected that we spotted the problem, and then we were able to put into place a solution for it.
Wow.
But if he
disasters, that you could walk into unwittingly.
Absolutely. And then we had another, even more ridiculously, I had one last year where, again, we set out in the contract what was included and all the rest of it, and we advised the client to actually go and inspect the property before completion. He turned up on the morning of completion to go and inspect the property and found that the seller had actually taken out the stained glass windows from the property and replaced them with plain glass windows.
Wow.
And that's astonishing. And again, because we advised them to have an inspection beforehand, and because the contract was strong, we were able to put into place a solution for that. So they ended up paying for new windows to be put in.
Absolutely, as you would expect, but all of these little loopholes, isn't it? It's all of the loopholes that you could get caught in if you're not kind of savvy in your choices. So the takeaway message for you, what would that be if you were giving advice to people either right at the beginning or maybe halfway through but not feeling confident? What would you say to them?
First step is use an independent lawyer, and it has to be an independent lawyer, not a lawyer acting for the agent or the developer or the seller. They have to be looking after your interests and not the interests of anybody else. Second one is do your research. Do your research right at the beginning as early as possible to identify how the process works, who is who, what is what, how the procedure actually happens, how much it costs, and so forth. Think about what you're actually doing. Try and do things pretty much in the same way as you would over here, but accepting that the process is different. Don't expect it to work in exactly the same way over here as it does over here, because things are different, but the basic building blocks are going to be the same. And be sensible. So keep your wits about you, and if you're told something that seems to be either too good to be true or seems strange, ask yourself why that is. Because so many people we speak to, I help a lot of people sort problems out after they've got themselves into trouble. And so many people say to us, I wish I'd thought about that at the time, or it did seem a bit strange at the time. And just a bit of thought, stepping back from it and thinking, actually, does that make sense? Can save a lot of heartache.
Fantastic. Well, that all makes complete sense to me, but it is the kind of thing that maybe you do forget. I understand what you're saying about holiday mode. It doesn't surprise me.
No, it doesn't, and it happens regularly. And, even when we speak to people beforehand and sort of tell them to do these sort of things, they still forget. So it is a common occurrence, and it's not necessarily the purchaser's fault. It's just you get wrapped up in things, don't you?
Absolutely. Well, hopefully, after listening to your great advice, that will not happen to people. But thank you so much for taking the time out to chat to me today, Peter.
No problem at all.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
And you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. And thanks to Peter for sharing his insights about the pitfalls of not seeking proper legal advice when purchasing a property. I particularly liked hearing about his celebrity clientele, illuminating a few privacy issues that I genuinely had never considered. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. This podcast is produced by Kyero.com. Our mission is to connect you with estate agents and properties throughout Spain. Whether your dream home is a rustic farmhouse surrounded by olive groves or a lock-up and leave apartment on the seafront, you'll find everything you need at Kyero.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate your 5-star rating on iTunes. It helps us reach and connect more people with their dream home in Spain. And whenever you're ready, here are 4 ways we can help you. Ask a question by emailing Beth@Kyero.com. We'll try and answer them all in an upcoming Q&A episode. Get a location guide by emailing Beth@Kyero.com. We'll reply with the latest data and information on the areas you're interested in. Calculate your budget. Simply visit Kyero.com/budget, enter 2 numbers, and you're done. Be our guest. If you've already purchased your home in Spain, we would love for you to share your story on the podcast. Just email Beth@Kyero.com and we'll take it from there. Tune in next week when I speak with Carol, a teacher from Jordanstown, Northern Ireland. She purchased her new home in Rhoda Golf Resort, Murcia. And I can't wait to tell you about how, as a single buyer, Carol surprised her friends and family by taking a leap of faith. I'm Beth Davison, and you've been listening to the Kyero.com Spanish Property Podcast. I'll see you next week.